And T, have you spoken to this guy T before?
That's Time Bandit.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah,
All right.
he's
So I'm gonna leave you to your resources again and
okay.
hope you go live. Oh, you are live. All right.
Yeah, wouldn't you know it?
You're so sneaky.
Aren't
Bye.
I though?
I guess I'll dip for a bit now and let you do your. I assume you're just going to read through the.
I'm going to read and interrupt myself and argue with you about it because,
No.
we're trying to figure this thing out, right? We're groping for God, right? And I would be pleased if you'd hang out and interrupt and we could have a good discussion because in the beginning was the conversation and the conversation was toward God. You know what I mean?
Cool.
Because as according to me, you're a good egg.
Yeah, I ask really off the wall questions though. My mind's all over the place.
Off the wall questions sometimes are good and sometimes they're annoying. Welcome, brothers and sisters. It's 23 minutes past the hour. If you want to open brawl, go over to JG's Hangout. They're doing an open brawl over there. But for us tonight, we're gonna go over Brother Knoch's essay called "Sin for Sin," and it's in Brother Knoch's book called "The Problem of Evil and the Judgments of God." And I understand that there are a number of books out there by theologians and philosophers that try to deal with the problem of evil. But according to me, Brother Knoch's book it knocks it out of the park. It really shows the beauty in the idea that we can trust God's word, which says God created both good and evil. There's only one creator. So just because we don't understand evil or its presence in the world doesn't mean that we can't understand it. And so his book, The Problem of Evil and the Judgments of God, deal with so many topics. And I read it 45 years ago, and it really changed my life. And so frequently, Lord willing, we'll be reading it from time to time on this little old hangout here. Thanks for joining me. Subscribe if you haven't. Resubscribe if they booted you off. Get the bell notifications if that's still a thing out there. Leave comments and give me a thumbs up. Okay, sin for sin. Nowhere perhaps are man's theories and God's thoughts further apart than on the means of dealing with sin. Oh my God, what a lovely way to introduce this chapter. Because, you go over to the Christian channels and their basic message is the way God deals with sin is he just wants you to stop sinning and hurry up because he's really pissed. But, so let's read it again. Nowhere perhaps are man's theories and God's thoughts. Get it? Further apart than on the means of dealing with sins. Okay, so what are God's thoughts? Well, according to my experience in Christianity, you wouldn't know God's thoughts because if you go to church, all you hear is Christianity. You don't necessarily find serious Bible students in Christianity. They got other things to do. They got bills to pay. They can't be, screwing around studying the Bible. And I didn't really, in my own personal experience, I didn't really become a Bible student until I left Christianity. Okay. This divergence is limited to theology. However, for in other walks of life, man finds his ideas will not work, so reverts to the true and practical solution. Man atones for misdeeds by good conduct. There you go. That's what the Christians tell you. Stop sinning and hurry it up. And if you stop sinning, go ahead and feed the poor. That'll help. Man atones, quote unquote, atones for misdeeds by good conduct. God demands another wrong to make a matter right. Get this memo over to them there Calvary Chapel preachers, them there vineyard preachers, them there Catholic priests. God demands another wrong to make a matter right. Let us admit that this seems so far wrong that few will even consider it. We have a proverb, 2 wrongs never make a right. Indeed, in man's moral ethics, uncontrolled by God, it would be a dangerous doctrine, for it is only when 2 wrongs are properly related to each other that they are mutually corrective. Not long since I had a striking experience of how 2 mistakes may combine with a perfect, happy effect. We were building an evangelistic van. This was written 100 years ago or so, back when cars were rather new. We were building an evangelistic van. Someone unknown to me jacked up one of the rear wheels. After the hardwood framework had been carefully set so as to be square and the post perpendicular, the jack was found and taken away. Then the whole rear end leaned over to one side an inch or 2. I had tried to force the frame into position, but it had been securely bolted and would not budge. After losing nearly a night's sleep over it, it suddenly occurred to me that the large swinging door would have a tendency to throw the post out a perpendicular. On testing out the idea, it was found that the weight of the door exactly counterbalanced the slant of the post and made them perfectly plumb. Well, sure. How about that for a metaphor? Here we have a practical example of a mistake and its justification. I acknowledge freely that it was my mistake to get the door post out of plumb, but I insist I was justified by the outcome. Any carpenter or builder can appreciate the possibility of making such a mistake, but they do not issue instructions to make them, for their happy outcome is beyond human control. In other spheres, however, the principle is recognized and applied. In all commercial transactions and in bookkeeping, it would be exceedingly silly to try and correct a mistake by doing it right. If a man is overcharged, he is not satisfied to be charged what is right on other items, but he wants a rebate. This, of course, is essentially wrong, for it is a payment for nothing. A friend recently forgot to deduct $10 from the bill for printing our magazine. How is he going to make it right? Not by doing it again, no, but by wrongly deducting it from the next bill. God's earliest lesson in quote-unquote atonement or sheltering is full of significance. Adam had sinned. He tried to cover himself with fig leaves. He did not do another wrong to cover his first offense. But God is not satisfied. He sacrifices an innocent lamb to provide a covering. On what ground could we have justified Adam if he had taken the life of a lamb to clothe himself? But are we doing this very thing? Are we not doing this very thing every day? Creatures against whom no charge can be laid are slaughtered for the peltries to provide our coverings. Man, that's really beautiful. Let me highlight that. Creatures, oops, I don't want it in green. How dare you? Let's go to yellow. Okay, creatures against whom no charge can be laid are slaughtered for peltries to provide our covering. The sin that brought the need of covering demands another wrong to repair it. Sin and sacrifice are constant associates, far closer in the vocabulary of the original than in any English version. In the 5th of the 2nd book of Corinthians, many margins make, quote unquote, he made him to be sin, end quote. He made him to be sin. That's what it says. But they put in, he made him a sin offering, on the ground that in the Hebrew, the phrase sin offering is simply sin. Our translators have not always been clear in their own minds how to render it. Thus, when they had always translated for a sin offering in the 14th verse of the 4th of Leviticus, they suddenly changed it to for the sin. Whether it is rendered a young bullock for the sin or for a sin offering, it may not seem to matter much until we see that it applies to the sacrifice of the bullock, not the sin of the congregation. Get it? Let's back up and make sure we do get it. Sin and sacrifice are constant associates, far closer in the vocabulary of the original than in any English version. In the 5th of the 2nd of Corinthians, many margins make he made him to be sin into he made him to be a sin offering, on the ground that in the Hebrew the phrase sin offering is simply sin. Our translators have not always been clear in their own minds how to render it. Thus, when they had always translated for a sin offering in the 14th verse of the 4th of Leviticus, they suddenly changed it to for the sin. Whether it is rendered a young bullock for the sin or for a sin offering may not seem to matter much until we see that it applies to the sacrifice of the bullock, not to the sin of the congregation. Oh. But some will say, how can a sacrifice to cover sin be itself a sin? Are you with me? Dang it. I got to change that the next time permanently. How can a sacrifice to cover sin be itself a sin? The point we wish to express at present is that in the inspired language of Scripture, there is no other term for it. And were we speaking Hebrew, we must always refer to the sin offering as the sin. Nor can we convince ourselves that this is merely accidental, a curious circumstance without reason or significance. On the contrary, it points to the path of truth. Let us consider carefully just what the offering of a sacrifice involves. Is there any aspect in which it too partakes of the nature of a sin or mistake? Following the flood, God gave animals to mankind for food. Occasionally, it is right to kill some unfortunate animal to put it out of its misery. But what would we think of a farmer who deliberately chose a young bullock? Hang on a second. What would we think of a young farmer who deliberately chose a young bullock, a perfect specimen of its kind, and killed it for no other purpose than to burn it up? He would be called a fool, or worse, a criminal. It was wrong to take the bullock's life. It did not deserve death, and its death served no useful purpose. Such an act would surely be a mistake. Yet this is precisely what the sacrifice for sin was, viewed apart from the sacred associations. Do we then wonder that it was called a sin by God Himself? Let us consider the real nature of the sin offering quite apart from those religious prejudices which have no place in the Scriptures, which hamper our thoughts and chain our reason. The hunter who slays wantonly for no other incentive than the lust to kill justly forfeits the respect of mankind. Some may justify it as a sport, but who would consider the sacrifice of a young bullock in that light? Were the flesh or the skin needed or used for the support of human life, it might be condoned, but no. The only reason for its death is that the owner has done wrong. Can the slaying of a perfect, inoffensive, useful creature be regarded in any sense as right? Does it compensate for the sin for which it is offered? Does it alleviate the loss of the one who suffers from the sin? From the human standpoint, apart from the illumination afforded by divine revelation, it was a human mistake. It was a huge mistake. Propitiation, a shelter for sin, was by means of a sin offering. One mistake, contrary to the divine precepts, was temporarily met and covered over by another, which was in accord with his ritual. Does not this account for the fact that the bullock was not burned on the altar in the sacred courts, but at a distance far from the divine dwelling outside the camp? Being a sin, it was brought far from the holy dwelling place of God and consumed with fire. It was thus that Elisha healed the waters of Jericho. Being so near the salt sea leads us to suppose the waters alkaline and thus unfit for use. What is the remedy? Elisha cast salt into the water. It should have made it worse. But by the divine alchemy, it cleared the waters. God's ways and man's are not the same. We would not commend salt as a purifier of water unless the divine chemist prescribed it. Neither would we advise anyone in order to cover a previous sin. I'm sorry, I missed a word. Let me go back. Neither would we advise anyone to sin in order to cover a previous sin. Only God's will and wisdom can correct sin by sin. The cross of Christ is the touchstone of truth. Ooh, let's highlight that because, we are fond of this idea here. The cross of Christ is the touchstone of truth. If we find that it confirms our faith, we need have no fear of its felicity. But if it fails to confirm it, we may well view our theology with suspicion and distrust. We now desire to consider the great crisis in the career of Christ entirely apart from all else but his dealings with God. Are you with me? We now desire to consider the great crisis in the career of Christ entirely apart from all else but his dealings with God. Man's attitudes and acts and Satan's persecution we reserve for another time. It is evident on the surface that the latter part of our Lord's ministry was weighted with his impending doom, which even caused a clash between himself and one of his disciples. But it is not till we reach Gethsemane that the veil is torn aside and we get a glimpse of the awfulness of the cross as it affects his fellowship with God. Hitherto, the will of Christ was in perfect parallel with that of his Father. True, he did not do his own will, but he acquiesced in the divine will and cheerfully. and with his whole heart. But now he begs that the cup pass from him. His will is not at all in line with the will of God. But the will is not the final arbiter. The heart may furnish motives deeper and more powerful. So he adds, not my will, but thine be done. Luke 22:42. We need not ask the question. We need not even ask the question whether he had a right to refuse to drink the cup which God had put into his lips. God himself had opened the heavens and testified that he was delighted with his beloved Son. Christ had challenged anyone to convict him of sin, and no one even dared try. Pilate washed his hands of the case. Heaven and earth and the very demons declared his righteousness. There were no flaws in him. Was it right then that he should suffer so severely at the very anticipation, drew clots of blood from his agonized brow? We are not now concerned with the physical pain and shame inflicted by men. How undeserved that was, we shall see again. Men are ignorant, as he himself declared when he prayed, Father, forgive them, for they are not aware what they are doing. Luke 23, verse 34. Men are unjust and hateful, so we have no difficulty in understanding their attitude toward the Holy One of God. We are now concerned only with those most mysterious and terrible of all his sufferings, the loss of fellowship, the averted face, the active hostility of God himself, which wrung from him the orphan cry, my God, why didst thou forsake me? The terror of those 3 hours of darkness, when the sun of his life was hid from his soul, surpassed the power of the pen. Yet the psalmist compares it with the force of fire and water and the sword. Psalm 18 and 22 and 69. This was God's dealings with his Son. Our present question is, was it right? Was it right? Did Christ deserve such suffering? Was there any ground in his relationship with God for the distance and despair which he endured? All will agree, even an infidel will concede, that if anyone ever deserved the opposite, it was that lowly, holy man. We are face to face then with this great truth, that God did visit with direst evil the dearest object in his universe. God does inflict evil even when no direct blame exists. The fact that sin had invaded the universe is no reason why Christ should suffer. The fact that sin had invaded the universe is no reason why Christ should suffer. Dang it, I don't know how to get that thing to stay on yellow. Okay, the fact that sin had invaded the universe is no reason why Christ should suffer. The penalty of sin applies to the sinner, not the only one who was not corrupted by its contact. We are now confining ourselves to a consideration of the justice of his case and exclude all higher thoughts. It will not destroy this truth to say that his case was exceptional and that the apparent wrong was justified by the results to mankind and the whole creation. This is most true. It is the very truth for which we contend. God uses evil to attain a higher good. It is the means he employs in turning his creatures from neutral indifference to an active and affectionate response to his love. The attitude of God toward Christ on the cross is, in reality, a much deeper quote unquote problem than the entrance of evil or sin. When evil came into creation, creation was neutral, neither good nor bad. But let's see, if it did not deserve evil, neither did it deserve good. Not so with our Lord. The glories he had before he emptied himself to become the man entitled to him, the glories he had before he emptied himself to become a man entitled him to respect and honor. The life he lived, the service he performed in his humiliation, called forth praise and demanded a suitable reward. There was not the slightest cause in him for divine condemnation. If we are backward in acknowledging that evil came into the world in accord with God's purpose, what shall we say of his treatment of Christ? Christ did not want to drink of the cup set before him, yet this was God's will. The shame and indignity heaped upon him during his ministry were not deserved. We acknowledge that men were direfully wrong in their treatment of him. What then shall we say of God, who forsook him in his deepest need, who sent fire from above to his bones, and more than this, desires to crush him? Isaiah 53:10. There was only one greater wrong in all the universe than that he should be a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and that was that his sorest affliction should come from the heart of his God and Father. Let everyone who imagines that God has no connection with evil listen to that lonely, forlorn cry of the forsaken son, my God, why didst thou forsake me?" In vindication, we point to the infinitely blessed results flowing from it. We find that even the sufferer himself shall see the travail of his soul and be satisfied. And this answer, which suffices for the first entrance of evil as well as for its foremost example, murder, is an evil of the first degree. To take the life of an enemy is usually punishable with death. To take the life of a friend is far worse. And one who slays his own beloved ones is usually judged insane, for it is a crime too terrible for a rational being to commit. Mercy. It is this thought which intrudes itself upon us when we read of the faith of Abraham when he offered up his son Isaac. He doubtless felt the same as we do about it, for we know that he consoled himself with the thought that God, who was in reality responsible for the apparent crime, could take care of its consequences, for he could rouse Isaac from the dead. See Genesis 28 and Hebrews 11. The chief interest for us lies not in Abraham's deed, for he did not actually slay his son, but in the great antitype when God and his son came to Golgotha. Then there was no substitute, but the Father's knife found its sheath in the Son whom he loved, and in whom all his hopes were centered. Our purpose in referring to it is to point out that from every human standard, Abraham's intended act was insanely criminal. It was absolutely without justification apart from the revealed will of God. What had Isaac done to deserve death? And infinitely more deserving, as was the son whom he represented, why should he be slain? If we confine our inquiry to Christ and God in their past relationship and exclude the sin of man and creation and the benefits to come to all through his sacrifice, we must confess that it was a temporary wrong to the victim. It is not this the thought underlying the fact that he was made a sin offering for our sakes, that we might become God's righteousness in him. 2 Corinthians 5:21. No man made him sin, and certainly Satan had no such laudable object in view. It was God who did it. It was God who did it, and to such purpose that it rectified and justified all other sins. The prevalent conception of the perfected universe, the prevalent conception of the perfected universe is one scarred and marred by sin. God's thought is infinitely higher. The cross of Christ has transmuted sin into righteousness, transgression into obedience, offense into reconciliation, hate into love. The cross of Christ has transmuted sin into righteousness, transgression into obedience, offense into reconciliation, hate into love. Temporarily, during the earthly kingdom, sin is pardoned, offenses are forgiven, but eventually sin is justified or vindicated. In itself, it is criminal. In combination with the crime of the cross, it is an essential factor in the revelation of God's heart. Let me read that again. Temporarily, during the earthly kingdom, sin is pardoned, offenses are forgiven. But eventually, sin is justified or vindicated. In itself, it is criminal. In combination with the crime of the cross, it is an essential factor in the revelation of God's heart. To recapitulate, God settles sin by sin. Every sin is transmuted by the sin of sins into an act essential to God's highest glory and to the creature's greatest good. Hang on a second while I mark this one too. To recapitulate, God settles sin by sin. Every sin is transmuted by the sin of sins into an act essential to God's highest glory and the creature's greatest good. All the righteousness and glory and honor which Christ are, all the righteousness and glory and honor which are Christ, either before his incarnation or after his glory, do not offset sin. His undeserved humiliation and distress and shame and death are sufficient to transform all sin into righteousness and holiness and bliss. The end.
Well, well, well.
Have you read this chapter before?
Nah.
And this is a perfect explanation or commentary on this great passage right here, 2 Corinthians 5:21, which says, he who knew no sin became sin for us.
Yeah. I still take it as a sin offering.
That's understandable. And even the concordant version has sin offering. But I sometimes erase the word offering. Hang on
No.
a s-
So we
Well,
have like a sinful Jesus. I guess a sinful God too.
yes, one mistake sometimes corrects another mistake. Like when you do an accounting,
Mm.
it's not right to, if you're $10 short, to throw $10 in there out of your own pocket.
Yeah, I still like the verse in what was it, Genesis 50 something?
Oh, verse 20?
Yeah,
You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good.
yeah,
Is that the one?
yeah.
It's that verse is not popular with a lot of Christians. So here we have 2 Corinthians 5 on the screen, baby. Yet all is of God. Is that raising an eyebrow? Yet all is of God, who conciliates us to himself through Christ and is giving us the dispensation of the conciliation. How that God was in Christ, conciliating the world to himself, not reckoning their offenses to them. He's using bookkeeping language here. He's not reckoning their offenses to them. If he was a proper bookkeeper, insisted on making everyone pay, what do we got? Well, that would be making everyone reckon their own offenses to them, right? But he's not reckoning their offenses to them and placing in us the word of the conciliation. For Christ's sin are we ambassadors as of God, entreating through us, we are beseeching for Christ's sake. Forgive God. Be conciliated to God. For the one not knowing sin, he makes to be sin, or a sin offering, as Howdy likes to say. For the one not knowing sin, he makes to be a sin offering for our sakes, that we may be becoming God's righteousness in him. What a big plan God has. That everyone for whom he died is going to become God's righteousness just because of this accounting mistake. What are you thinking?
I'm calculating. It's
Oh.
funny. Verse where it talks about what you calculated for evil, God calculated for good. I'm calculating the good and the evil here
Mm-hmm.
in my brain.
Let me know when you're done calculating. I want to hear the results.
That's gonna be a long time, probably.
Right, you're going to send me an email
Yeah,
and CC it to everybody else in the company.
it's evil.
I
It's
have
good.
concluded that the books are now balanced. Two wrongs do make a right. They make everything right. If the second wrong is sending Christ to the cross, that makes everything right.
Yeah, like what they did was wrong. Like he's pretty clear on that. If they had known, they would not have, assassinated your boy.
Uh huh. Yeah, I've thought about that passage a lot, and I don't. The way you just quoted it made it sound like if they had understood that it was wrong, they would not have assassinated Christ. But
Or
the
maybe
way
they would have if they, it makes that verse kind of silly though, because if you're saying if they realize that this is what they should do, wouldn't they have done it?
well, when I read the passage, I get the tone from it that if they had realized that God was going to accomplish so much in the cross of Christ and actually undo their personal power, because they're the rulers of this world, right? He was going to undo their personal power and destroy them, in essence, then they wouldn't have crucified the Lord. In other words, they didn't know that this is a big game changer. Like my time travel essay, this is going to change everything. All the way backwards, all the way forwards, this is going to change everything. And if they had known that, because remember when Jesus and Satan were having this chat, and Satan said, well, bow down to me and I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world. Remember that?
Yeah, I think Paul says that Satan is the god of this world.
And so when I look at that these days, and I see Satan saying, bow down to me, Jesus, and I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world, I see the ridiculousness of the discussion when I read it these days. Because Satan was making this offer, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the world. He was making it to Jesus, the Son of God, the one who already had power over all the kingdoms of the world, right? And by the way, why would he want to be the king of the Aztecs and the Incas and Shaka Khan? And why would he want to be, what's the purpose of that? He is here. He came actually in the long range plan. He came to destroy authority and power and rulership. And he will destroy. He will give up his kingdom to God. So it was, Satan was just blathering, and he didn't even know what the hell he was talking about. I will give you the kingdoms of Shaka Khan. Yeah, don't you want the kingdom of Shaka Khan? What? No, you're missing the whole point there, Bucky. He was there to go to the cross in order to destroy man and man's old humanity and to bring about a new humanity. And when it's complete, when his work is complete before everyone's eyes, there won't even be rulership, because I don't know if you know this, Howdy, but all government rulership is there using the threat of death. You will pay this parking ticket or I will kill you. I'll throw you in jail. You might die in jail. You will pay us taxes or we will blow up your city. It's the threat of death that gives them the power. And when Satan offered Jesus the kingdoms of this world, all he could offer was to Jesus to have the threat of death. And here Jesus knew what he was coming for. He was going to abolish death, starting with himself. Just thinking here.
No, I like the idea. Like if, let's say, like you believe on the power of the cross and you'll be resurrected, then you don't really listen to anybody. That's what you end up with, like a lot of martyrs. And Paul doesn't really care about anything. He's like, they'll throw me in jail, they'll kill me. I don't. It's whatever. It's nothing.
Yeah, the threat of death becomes less important if you know that it is God's doings to eventually abolish death and make all alive in Christ.
Yeah. That thought seems like really freeing. Like you don't have to care about anything. That's what Paul says. He's like, what does he say? If you act as that, like you're not connected to the world. I forget what he says exactly. Like we're not of this world. I'm trying to remember, but he's saying like, he goes really far. He's like, rejoice if you're not. And he always does that inversion where he like flips everything on his head. He's like, be happy if you're crying. Be sad if you're happy. If you have connections, act as like this. I have a lot of Paul's words in my head, and it's hard to straighten them out and speak.
I have a lot of Paul's words in my head too, and they're delicious. Like when he says, Christ will give up his kingdom to the Father. Oh, wow. But, during God's grand operations of the eons, there's coming, the 1,000-year reign of Christ, and he will be using the threat of death during that time, even though his bigger plan is to abolish death altogether. But I just think it's funny that Satan would offer Jesus the kingdom of the Aztecs, like he wants that.
Yeah,
Or
like
like,
say like he's like kind of wasting his time. He's like, if you bow to me, I will give you this, shiny coin. Ooh,
uh-huh.
it's like what?
Yeah, I got it from Chuck E. Cheese. You
You
ever
you
been to?
remember that story where like the Native Americans sold all their land for some turquoise beads or whatever?
I know, isn't that crazy?
Yeah, bow to me and I will give you this mystery box
Yeah, it
full
was
of
the
air.
it was the island of Manhattan. They sold Manhattan for some beads. They It's because the Indians didn't have a real estate agent.
Uh, reading through 2 Corinthians 5 again really quickly. He's like, don't worry about this life. We got our stuff with God. I remember, and then later in Corinthians, he's always talking about, he's arguing against lots of people, like obviously like the Gnostics, antinomians, and whatever people, Judaizers. But a lot of the time, he sort of has to like flex and throw his weight around. Like at the end, he's like, because there's like the quote unquote super apostles. Like
Mm-hmm.
we're like, oh, we're the super apostles. Like we're Jewish. We get paid for our talking and we're like wise. We like have like our philosophy and our all this stuff. And he's like, I could have asked you for money. Like that's my right as like you know according to the law or whatever. But I didn't want to burden anyone, so I could save as many as I could. And if I'm a fool, then I'm a fool for Christ sort of language near the end of Corinthians. And just like save people by my like he doesn't care. As long as I save you, I can be wise, I can be a fool, I can be a Jew, I can be a Gentile. Nothing in this world matters at all.
Uh-huh.
It's like, okay, you call me a fool, I'll be a fool. Call me whatever. It don't matter. The love of Christ.
So far, Howdy, what is your favorite letter of Paul?
Uh Galatians, well, Romans, I think is like the most important. Galatians is really fun though.
Uh-huh.
Romans is the most important. Galatians is really good.
I agree. And then I got to throw in Ephesians there too, because
You like
Ephesians,
the
like,
you like the eschatology stuff.
yeah, because Ephesians, I finally think I figured it out just in the last 3 days or so. Why Paul in Ephesians calls it a secret and that it was hid from the eons in God, the secret that he reveals. And, preterists will come over and say that, everything Paul said is in the Old Testament, blah, 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 right? And it does appear that when Paul is saying God is going to save all humanity, you can kind of get that stuff from the Old Testament, right? Not as clear and succinct as Paul's. But in Ephesians, oh my God, it goes far beyond all humanity. It goes to all of the heavenly beings, the sovereignties and authorities among the celestials. That was not revealed in the Old Testament, that God's going to bring all the celestial beings home. Surely that was not, widely known. It, and that's what Ephesians is really all about. Not just that God saves all the nations, or God saves all humanity, or God saves the ecclesia, which is his body, but the ecclesia, which is his body, will have a very important role in saving all the celestial beings, all of them. Now we're talking something big.
Yeah. Well, here's my hard thing about Paul currently is just reading through all his letters again. He's like so like it's not like scatterbrained, but it's like hectic. Like these are like letters. This isn't like a he didn't sit down and write this treatise. Like these are just like letters.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, they literally read like letters. That it's not as
Mm-hmm.
like scriptural, so to speak. And so like sometimes I'm like, is he just saying this just to say it, sort of thing? Because he's like saying anything. Like he'll say anything. And so like when at that one point where he's like, okay, you guys like want the prophecy, like that's what tickles your spine. Well, I was raptured to the third heaven, and I got to speak these things and do this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It's like whatever works, he's gonna say it. He'll take whatever's beside him and craft it into like a tool, and then like bludgeon Christ into people's heads any way he can.
So you say that Paul seems a little scatterbrained, but I've spent some time reading Charles Welch. You ever heard of that name?
Nah.
You can find him. He was like a great student of Bullinger, and like the right hand man of Bullinger. When Bullinger was an old man, Welch took over the work. And a lot of a lot of Charles Welch's writings is to show that Paul was not scatterbrained, that there was a great chiastic structure going through all of his letters, and it was like scientific. And one that I can remember, or I'll give you a couple that I can remember. Um, you know what a chiastic structure is?
No.
It's a rhyming scheme, but in English, in our culture, we rhyme with phonetics, Roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and I love you. So that's what we do with rhymes. But the chiastic structure is a rhyming of ideas. And so the chiastic structure, if you would give each topic a letter, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, the chiastic structure would go like this: A, B, C, C, B, A. A, B, C, C, B, A. And so Welch spends quite a bit of time showing many of Paul's letters. I don't know if he showed them all, but that many of Paul's letters have that chiastic structure right there. And one that I remember is in the first chapter of Romans, he says, I really want to come and visit you. And in the last chapter of Romans, he says, I really want to come and visit you. In the first chapter of Romans, he says something about faith obedience. And then in the last chapter of Romans, he says something about faith obedience. So, you can see the A, B, C, C, B, A. It doesn't have to be that exact structure. It could be A, B, A, B, C, A, B, A, B, C. Either way, you see a rhyming of ideas as the writer goes along, especially Paul. And of course, he sees the chiastic structure in Psalms and so forth. It's just a thing from those ancient writers. But so I thought I'd share that with you because you said Paul seems chaotic.
Yeah.
And so I have learned to see that Paul is not chaotic. He's really kind of a scientist with the structure of his ideas as he's going along. And I heard a sermon by Dean Huff. He's one of our heroes on this channel, right? And Dean Huff's sermon was on Romans 1:17, where Paul says, a righteousness of God is revealed. And Dean said, when you're writing and you've got a lot to say, you might forget to say it again. Or, you might not finish the whole thought because you got so many thoughts. And he said, notice in chapter 1, verse 17, he starts with the thought of the righteousness of God is being revealed. And then it appears that he gets distracted for the next two chapters, the rest of 1, chapter 2, and a little bit of chapter 3. He gets distracted by saying how useless man is. But by chapter 3, verse 21, he picks up the thought again about the righteousness of God is revealed, now revealed through the faith of Christ. And it was a lovely sermon by Dean Huff. And it you could see that he wasn't scatterbrained. He just had a lot to say, and he had to put it together with connectives and a bunch of yet now or but now.
Yeah, I noticed generally like he puts the exhortations and like there's the greeting obviously, then what he wants to say, and then he'll unless he's dealing with the antinomians, then like the whole thing is basically exhortation. But he generally goes greeting the body of what I'm trying to deal with, and then exhorting people to be good, do this, yada yada yada, and then the conclusion. And yeah, in Romans, like there's a little bit of disagreement about what sections or should be like bracketed off. Like is this verse are we gonna say it's with this passage or their stuff? But yeah, he'll say something, and then it's almost like a thought hits him, and he's like, actually, this like I mean it's related, but he seems to be like driving around a little bit.
I have read Romans out loud at one sitting many times. And I can tell you from my observation about the whole letter, I think the first 11 chapters are one unit of thought. And it feels like at chapter 11, at the end of chapter 11, he puts it down and he goes to sleep. And then he gets up for several days, a week or two. And then chapter 12 is almost like a postscript. And there seems to be 3 postscripts from 12 to 16. By the way. Oh, I forgot this. But 1 through 11, chapters 1 through 11, seem to be one glorious unit of thought. And when I started thinking this way and reading Paul's letters, with the big idea in mind, it made it delicious to stop doing the Christian thing, because the Christian thing is to take an individual little verse, and then use that as your self-help verse or whatever, or browbeating verse or a shaming verse.
You know what really quickly, what I hate is like on the Bible app, that I read on my phone, like just the Bible app, it'll say verse of the day. I'm like,
Yeah.
what do you mean verse of the day? You got it. Like it should be like letter. Read this letter today. Like, what do you mean a verse of the, like? How can you pull like? It's like it's so removed from the context.
I know, and that speaks to cheesiness, right? Like the guy who gets it and is excited about the verse of the day, he's too damn lazy to read anything else or consider. He's just letting the AI feed him the verse of the day.
Yeah, he's a little wild and unbound. I could see when I see. Okay, so when I'm envisioning like in Galatians, like Peter and Paul, for some reason I think I see Peter like sitting down, being kind of quiet, and going, "Oh, okay." And then I see Paul.
You mean after Paul yelled at him, he's sitting down?
Or during the whole time. He's like more demure. Paul, I think moves his hands around when he talks. He's really evocative.
Yeah. In chapter 2, when Paul gets up in his face, that's the most dynamic little scene to me. It's almost like a fist fight. And Peter doesn't know what to do except wipe his bloody nose.
He doesn't care about anything.
How dare you self-censure? When the James gang shows up, you pull away from the Gentile brothers? What the hell are you doing? Acting all self-righteous, like you're better than any of us bacon-eating, beer-drinking brothers.
I mean, I guess Paul does have like that singular thing is like, Christ. Like he's really, really hyper focused. So it's not like he has a lot of different. I mean, he has a lot of different concepts, but he's really firm. I don't know how to explain it.
Try. Use your words. He's really firm about what?
Love of Christ, I guess, mainly
Mm-hmm.
being lavished with, or like righteousness and or what's funny. I just something just popped into my head that he said. I think he says like love is even bigger than belief and bigger than justice and righteousness and one thing.
Yeah, I believe he
He says
does.
the main three is like righteousness, love, and
Faith.
and faith.
Yeah.
But among these, love is the greatest. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
what? How is love the greatest? Like, it's all about faithing. What are you saying? Love is the greatest. And then he'll say stuff like, not providing for your family, you're worse than an unbeliever. And then he's like, he's really okay. So this is my problem reading through Paul is like, does he really mean exactly what he's saying here, or is this more of like is he being hyperbolic? Because it comes like off the wall, like hyperbolically. So
Define
I'm always
hyperbolic for us.
it's when you're exaggerative, like for illustrative purposes. Like I'm so
Yeah.
hungry I could eat a horse. Like you
Right.
couldn't eat a horse. Like you're only like 100 pounds. You can't eat a horse. Well, it just means that I'm very hungry.
Mm-hmm.
So he'll say these things. It's like, are you being like exact with what you're saying here? Like, is really a person who doesn't provide worse than an unbeliever? Are you really saying that love is greater than faithing? Are you really saying that? And one of them's hilarious when he's talking about, oh, don't eat meat sacrificed to that. Like it's like idols or nothing. Like you can eat the meat, whatever is provided for you, but don't eat it if it harms another brother, sort of
Yeah.
thing.
Uh-huh.
And then he'll say, we have these rules. Okay, here are the rules of the church. And then he'll say, but if anyone has a problem with these aren't our rules. Sort of. It's like, what are you talking about? Or he'll say, what will he say? Every like, I don't know. A lot of stuff that a lot of people have trouble struggling with, like, oh, everything's permissible, not everything is expedient, sort of thing. And then it's like, what do you mean, Paul?
Well, if you go find Charles Welch in his material,
You got it all straightened out.
yeah, he does cover this, how to understand it. And he points out that Paul's earlier letters were speaking to Jews to some extent, and Paul, in his early career, was preaching the gospel of the circumcision, and then he moves to a transitional time period where he speaks both to the Jew and the Greek, and then by Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians, it's no, he's not addressing the Jews at all. And so that thought kind of helps me see that Paul is insistent when he's speaking to the Jews in Romans. It appears that he's speaking to the Jews, but then he's also speaking to a bunch of Greeks who are in Rome, because it says so in chapter 16. They were all Greeks there, right? So it makes sense that to see that Paul, his message changed. And at the beginning, he was leaning toward the gospel of the circumcision or the kingdom gospel. And so we'd be a little more rough. And then after Acts 28:28, when he's in prison, the whole tone and tenor changes. And it's some of these brothers they call themselves Acts 28:28 brothers. They call Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians the perfection epistles. But Charles Welch was like the kingpin of this line of thinking, that at Acts 28:28 everything changed, and whatever Paul wrote from prison is more significant than the other letters of Paul.
I feel bad for that guy. He had circumcised just so he could go. He would have an easier time evangelizing.
Right, yeah.
He's
Titus,
like,
I think.
because on one side he'll say, if you circumcise, you're a debtor to the whole law, and Christ will have died gratuitously. Also, we need to go preach this to these guys, so you got to get circumcised so we can walk around in there.
Yeah, so how would you handle that apparent contradiction?
He doesn't. That's what I'm saying. I think he doesn't care about anything other than evangelization. He's getting the word of God to everyone by any means necessary. That's what I'm saying. Any means.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't care about anything.
Mr. P. Patrick, James will not be revealed as a gang member. So when I use the term James gang, I sometimes, clarify myself. The guys who showed up in Galatians chapter 2, verse 12, a bunch of guys showed up from James. I don't believe that James sent them, because if you look at the dynamics of what was going on at the time, the church in Jerusalem had somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 members in the church. And James was the obvious kingpin of the church in Jerusalem because he was the half brother of the Lord. And he didn't get caught in bed with the deacon's wife. There was no reason to find fault with him. And because he was the half brother of the Lord, it just was natural, shall we call it, nepotism, right? Of course, he would be favored to be the leading brother of the Jerusalem ecclesia. And so with 10 to 15,000 people in the Jerusalem church, there's no way in hell that James can control that many people and give them all a unified thought. And so these guys who came from James, Galatians 2:12, I don't think that they were sent by James. They just were using James as their certificate of browbeating. Surely James wouldn't disagree with us. Hey, Peter, stop eating with those Gentiles. What the hell are you doing? They made... And Peter bowed down to these guys who came from James, essentially, because Peter knew that he couldn't stay in Antioch. That was not his home. He knew that he had to go back to Jerusalem and live with these knuckleheads who just showed up in Galatians 2:12. So there was a lot of psychological stuff going on there and sociological stuff going on there. It wasn't theology. James didn't necessarily send the James gang to Antioch to harass Peter and the other Jewish brothers. They just showed up because they were self-righteous and persnickety, and they're like our popular boys down the hall, Eric and Jill and JG, and the self-righteous ones. That's why I feel free to call them the James gang, not because they actually came from James and had the authority of James behind them. It was a chaotic, shall we say, a little bit of chaotic and confusion in a church which had 10,000 or more members. There was, surely there was divisions and factions, and everybody's trying to build a little fiefdom to themselves. And these guys showed up in Antioch, and they wanted to make sure that Peter wasn't eating bacon burgers with the Gentiles. And of course, Peter bowed to them. He withdrew. He feared those guys from James. And Barnabas fell in with them. And the rest of the Jews played the hypocrite with them. So James, he was probably a decent dude, and he was probably shocked if he actually heard about this incident in Antioch. And I think they even had a meeting after that incident in Antioch in which James heard the matter, because Paul went to Jerusalem to straighten out this problem. And at the end of the big conference, the big brothers meeting, James wrote a letter to the saints in Antioch and said, don't eat blood and don't mess with temple prostitutes. That's it. He didn't really add anything to the evangel of our salvation. He wrote that letter so he could look like he had authority, and so he could look like he had the last word. There was no great revelation in James's letter to the saints in Antioch.
What's crazy to me about that is, like, he doesn't even he goes out of his way. He says, I didn't bow for a moment. Like, I didn't even consider what they were saying. Like
Mm-hmm.
whatever the other apostles were saying to me, not even for a second. I was like, no, you're wrong. It's like, oh, okay. Very emphatic. He's very confident. Okay, that's another good word for Paul. He's very confident.
You know, and the more I become a student of Paul, the more I feel confident as well. And so I'm kind of amazed when the Christians come over here and say stupid things like, I don't know if I'm saved, but I'm a Christian, I repented, I obey, but I just don't know if I'm saved until I get to the the great white throne. What? It freaks me out, kind of, that they would say they would doubt their own salvation, because if they doubt their salvation, then they don't know that they were saved 2,000 years ago by Christ's work on the cross. And I'm going like, what? It's surprising how many of them are not sure. They're not confident in the work of God on the cross of Christ.
Should we be confident in the blood of Christ, do you think?
Yes, it changes everything about everything. It's so dynamic that it will reconcile the universe, not just all the humans. It will reconcile the universe back to God. So our salvation, of course, it's guaranteed. And so why can't the knuckleheads who come over here from JG's channel elsewhere, be as confident in their Lord's work on the cross, in the salvation of God? Why can't they be confident about that? No, because they believe that their salvation is their doing. And if it is their doing, well, of course they're going to be skittish about, well, I don't know if I'm saved, but I pray. And do you pray, Ace? How dare you?
Hmm.
It's fun to be confident in Christ's work on the cross.
Yeah, but that's just wild to me. Like even I'm thinking in my head, even if I was Saul of Tarsus, and Jesus came down, I was like, oh, okay, for sure. And then I just run around like Paul evangelizing, and then I run into like his disciples, and his disciples are doing something different. I would at least would be like, oh, maybe I'm doing something wrong, right? Like these were his disciples. Like I can't even fathom not even relenting for a moment. Like so it's just a weird. I can't comprehend like his. He's
Right.
very brazen.
I know. We didn't put up with their horseshit for 1 hour, he says in Galatians. They snuck in to spy out our freedom. That is confidence. And you go to regular churches and YouTube churches, and they've got no idea how much freedom they actually have in Christ. And they don't preach any kind of freedom. It's you better fear, you better repent, and you better hurry up and stop sinning before your clock is up.
Yeah, Paul's in this like weird. He's really right. He's really walking down a very tight line. On one hand, being antinomian and murder and do whatever, pillage and do whatever you want. It's all chill because he does exhort the opposite of that. He's saying do good.
Mm-hmm.
In every letter, he's constantly make yourself like worthy, present yourself blameless, yada yada yada. But on the other hand, he's saying, well, you're dead to the law. We're all failures, and so it's okay. So how do you balance that? And then everyone falls into one of these two sides of the buckets. Either Paul's being silly on this side or Paul's being silly on that side. Like if you take him serious everywhere, it's like you said, like those seeming sort of contradictions.
Mm-hmm. Some of the contradictions are cleaned up by proper translation, but some of them I think are cleaned up by an understanding of the sociology going on. Not psychology, the sociology. Like like in Corinthians, the first letter to the Corinthians, I suspect that all of the brothers there, or the vast majority of brothers, were like 20 years old and 30 years old. So they were horny. So of course they had promiscuity going on, and he's got to correct them about that. But by the time he writes Ephesians, it's like 30 years later. And so the saints, if they stuck with it, they're not 30 anymore, they're 60 years old. And so they're too old to cut the mustard. They're more able to consider more serious topics in the scripture.
Right. Yeah. Like he's always focused on like specific, like he like I said, he doesn't have like this gospel treatise. He doesn't have like the whole thing laid out. It's always just letters dealing with like whatever's at hand. So it's a little bit harder to parse it out. One thing that's interesting is like when he says, what to do about this? I don't know. I think you should do that. Or like, if you're married, it's fine. If you're not, it's fine. But I think this, I'm not inspired here. But this is a command I get from the Lord here. It's like, it's a little jumbled, but
All right, see this verse 31 that kind of matches with what you just said. Are we then nullifying the law through faith? Then he says, oh, hell no. Indeed, we are sustaining law. And this verse, I'm sure that most people, it goes over their head, but taken in context, Paul has just, this is chapter 3, verse 31, right? Paul has just spent 3 chapters browbeating the law itself and how useless it is. And up here in verse 21, 22, 23, we have something amazing where it says, apart from law, a righteousness of God is manifest, being attested by the law and the prophets, yet a righteousness of God through Jesus Christ's faith. Okay, and then, so he's browbeating the law and says, apart from law, a righteousness of God is manifest. It must be a reference to what God was doing in Christ's cross, because not too far away, we have something going on through God's faith in his son's blood. So that must be a reference to the cross. And then down at 31, he says, are we nullifying the law? No, we're actually sustaining the law. And I take this to mean that we, the Gentile brothers who don't give a crap about the law, we're so in love with Christ and God that we naturally make the law look good. We make the law look better than the Jews make it look.
Yeah, he says the law is for murderers and bad people. Like obviously, like if you're a good person, you don't really need law because you're just naturally lawful or whatever. But then he'll say, oh, this person's lawless is like a derogatory. And then he'll say, oh, the law is holy. And then on another, he said he's like dead to the law. And then if he rebuilds the law, he condemns himself as a transgressor. So in some sense, he's saying like he's destroyed the law. And he also says the glory of this is greater than he said the law was so glorious that the people couldn't look on Moses' face. And if the law was that glorious, how much more glorious is this thing that's replacing it?
Mm-hmm.
So what's the deal? Is it gone? Is it here? The law. Well, he certainly doesn't like the fast. He doesn't like the sort of like the people indicators is what some people call this. The feasts, the Sabbaths, the circumcision, and the dietary restrictions. Those he's completely out the door with that.
Mm-hmm.
He never exhorts someone, oh, try to get circumcised, oh, try to keep to the dietary restrictions, or oh, try to keep the Sabbaths. He's done with that. But it's mainly like the command that Christ gave. He's like, I'm in the law of Christ. He references that once where it's like, okay, there's one commandment, love God and love your brother. But you could simplify that to one, because if you love God, then you would love your brother. So essentially it's just love God.
Mm-hmm.
So is he talking about that? Like what's funny is when it's like every time this comes up, whenever Paul says the word law, every time he says it, there's 10 scholars arguing, is this the Mosaic law? Is this the law of Christ? Is this the law, like all law? Is this Noahide? Is this, what is this? He's not, Paul isn't very specific when I wish he would have been a bit more specific. But again, it's just letters. Like, I don't even think Paul expected this to be scripture. He was just telling people.
You see verse 28 here on the screen?
But then his boasting, he hates boasting. That's what he says a lot of times. If I boast in Christ. He says boasting like 30. I was reading through all of his letters, and he says boasting like 100 times at least. He's really on about boasting. Where then is boasting? It is debarred. Through what law? Of works. No, but through faith's law. For we are reckoning a man to be justified by faith, apart from works of the law.
So what is faith's law?
I guess if you faith, you get justified or something.
Yeah.
Or if Christ, or I guess in your interpretation of Christ faiths, then
right.
Yeah.
But knowing the style of writing, Paul has just spent these 3 chapters. This is chapter 3, browbeating the law itself. And has nothing good to say about the law in 3 chapters. Okay. In fact, in verse 21, he says, apart from law, a righteousness of God is manifest. Apart from law. So he's browbeating the law left and right. And now it's I would call it a pattern interrupt to use the word law in a favorable kind of way and talk about the law of faith. So he's not even talking about the law right here, that just because you have the faith doesn't mean that you're going to go back into the law. No, it's the effectiveness of faith, like the law of gravity. We know what that is. There's nothing you must do about the law of gravity, except it will do something to you if you don't, watch your step. So what is faith's law? It's the what we may expect from the faith of Christ. It's going to happen. It's so going to happen that we can call it a law. And it's not even that, he's using the word law here in a fine figure of speech, and he's just contradicted his own tone and rhythm for the first 3 chapters of browbeating the law. And now he's using a strange phrase that we are reckoned justified through faith's law. It's going to happen. It's a powerful concept.
Yeah, I don't think it's because he's still like, there's still this law thing hanging around, whatever it is. It's not a problem with Romans, it's more of a problem with flesh and spirit, mainly. He's not saying this law is bad or that law is good. He's saying, it's good for like its purpose or something. And that the problem is...
Yeah, so what's the law of gravity? What's the law of thermodynamics? Is it something you have to do? Or is it something that is established and we may count on? What is the law of faith? It's something that we may count on. And all we have is words. We're doing the best we can with the words we have.
I mean, it has to be apart from law because everyone fails according to the law. So he can't promise anything to anyone with a law. Like one of the big important ones is when he compares like the Mosaic and Abrahamic covenants. He's saying that like the covenantal promises to Abraham were without, qualifications. It wasn't like, if you do this, I will give you this. He just said, I will give you this, that, and the third. And then the Mosaic law that came later I think Paul says was a foreshadowing, or to condemn the world and all this other stuff, and then we go back to the promise, which was unconditional. But the question is, like, is it really unconditional if you have to faith to get it?
Well, yes, of course, because when you have to faith, it doesn't mean that you have to faith. It's the faith of Christ that's somehow given to you, but it's not given to all yet. Cool your heels. All will have the faith. All will be doubting Thomas and stick their fingers in his nail prints, and it'll be obvious. It'll be faith mixed with the obvious. And everyone will say, like Paul prayed on the road to Damascus, he prayed, uh-oh, oh my.
Right.
He didn't pray, I have sinned, forgive me.
Well, what do you do with the verse where Jesus says, "Blessed are you who have seen"? Oh, I guess you could always say that. Like where he says, "Blessed are those who have not seen," but you're saying everyone's going to see it.
Everyone will see it, and every knee will bow, and every heart will be changed. This is faith's law, apart from works of law.
Yeah. Well, I guess we should push it back to the topic of
sin for sin?
Sin for sin. I still disagree, though. Like this is one of the ones that I'm really open to a lot of things, but this one I just can't. I just don't jive with it.
Explain. What
Like,
bugs you about it?
God being the author of evil, sort of thing.
But what if evil is temporary? I mean, I know it's a metaphor, but what if we're talking about a sculptor and he takes this beautiful stone and he starts hacking away at it? Isn't that evil? Chopping away at it little by little until he gets the statue of David that he wants.
I don't mind that. I don't even mind like the flood. I don't mind, having everyone even slaughter each other like 100 times in the OT. Mm-hmm. But so it's hard to explain like what my problem is that it's more like he's using what people are doing for good rather than making them do bad to do good, because it's like he would just make them do good at that point. Like, why go through the hoops? For example, let's take the premier example, Genesis 50:20. Let's just say God wanted to force what's his name to go to wherever. Like Egypt. It would have been easy. Yeah, it would have been easy just for him to make his brothers give him a ride there. Why would God go through the trouble of making him get thrown down a well? Like, that seems like pointless. And it makes more sense for it to be like, oh, well, he can use the evils of men for, like, obviously, like, okay, so like you can slap a child's hand away so that they don't, touch the stove. So you can like use like small, like from our perspective, like we can do like small evil things to prevent greater evil things.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't even say that God really biblically does that. It's more like he can, I don't know, it's hard to explain how God operates, like with his prescience and stuff.
How many days are there in a week?
At least 7.
All right. How many eons are in God's Aeonian purpose?
At least 7.
No.
Why does he like the number 7 so much?
5. There's 5 eons in God's Aeonian purpose, according to how we break it down on this channel. And 5 eons is not very long. And when we're done, well, I'm sure we'll all look back and say, well, that wasn't so bad. I was alive for 70 years of it, and that ain't bad.
Right. I understand like what you're getting at. Like, you're not like, it's obviously not a big deal. Like if we're like essentially immortal, and like our pain or whatever would be very temporary. So it's like not a big deal. It's like, oh, God allowed you to or God like stubbed your toe. Like it's like, okay, like it's not like a big deal, but
And even if it was worse than stubbing the toe, if you, got burned in a house fire and died, at the consummation, you'll be made perfectly alive with an immortal body, and you're not going to look back and complain much, I don't imagine.
okay, well, if it's not like such a big deal, why does God always act like it's a big deal? Like in the Old Testament, like 80% of everything he says is what you have done. I can't believe what you have done. I will punish you. And he's
Mm-hmm.
very like graphic. You know what I mean? He seems to care a
Mm-hmm.
lot.
He does that with Israel. He didn't do that with the Aztecs because Israel was his chosen nation. The Aztecs were not.
He did it with other nations too. I mean, he mainly disciplined Israel, but he said, for what whenever he has like other nations hurt Israel, and he's like, they have gone too far, therefore I will punish them. Like he punishes like 50 different nations back then.
Here, read this call out for you.
Yeah, I understand. Like you got to break eggs to make omelets, sort of thing.
No,
But the
this is
question is, like, why does God have to break eggs to make an omelet? He could just make an omelet because he's God. Why go through the rigmarole?
got me.
I like Paul uses that metaphor too. I'm having birth pains for you. Paul's also emotional too. He's always rejoicing or he's always sobbing. He's either rejoicing or sobbing at each point. Except
Mm.
in Romans, and if you say he wrote Hebrews, and there he's like not emotional. But in the letters to the churches, he's very personal.
Do you have this book, The Problem of Evil?
No, I don't have a problem with the problem of evil.
Yeah, you just said you did.
Well, I have a problem with God's evil. That'd be a problem, seemingly.
Well, what other evil are we talking about? Oh,
Well,
you don't
how
mind man's evil, but you mind God's evil.
right?
Well, the difference to me is that when man does evil, he can't undo it. But when God does evil, he does undo it and turns it into good. It's just a bigger picture. What do you want? You're like a standing bear being dragged back to the truck by Sheriff Longmire, and you say, "Are we there yet?" You want God to hurry up and save the day, and not break any more omelets.
Okay, so it's like I'm watching God, and God is slapping someone so that they behave. When he doesn't have to do that, he could just snap his fingers and they would behave. See what I'm
Hmm.
saying?
I hear what you're saying, and I've heard it from many,
Hmm.
and I don't know what to say.
That's fine.
Are these matters of faith, or are they matters of your logic?
Well, it's not just mine. I mean, the church has sort of answered it by saying, well, a lot of different things that you don't agree with. But
What? That God didn't create evil?
yeah, they say
Man
it's like,
created evil?
well, they say like evil doesn't exist. It's like just a deprivation of God, and we'll go to like the
Well, is that
separation
true? Is that
verses and
true?
the pause. I mean, they do have some verses. They have like the eternal life is knowing you, and that the destruction is separation from you. So if God withdraws His presence, that um, so essentially everything good is just by the grace of God, and then if God retreats, then evil sort of, you know.
And did God separate from Christ on the cross?
Ooh, this is why I'm leaning towards like it's so hard to get around that verse. Like they'll say, "Oh, he's just referencing, Jeremiah or whatever," and it's like a lamentation. But and then in Gethsemane, like the verses that are in this guy's chapter here, I think are really important. Like it's so hard for me to get away from Arianism, because you have to say no if you're a Trinitarian. Like God can't harm himself like that. As far as because they'll say stuff like, okay, Christ can't be forsaken, Christ can't be made sin, Christ can't be accursed, Christ, and he can't be if he's like the Trinity as they describe it. So
Yeah.
it's hard. I mean, I lean towards your side of it. Like I could see him being forsaken as a creature. That's easy. Can he forsake himself? It doesn't. It's hard to understand.
Yeah, which is why I don't go for Trinity lingo on this channel. It creates too many problems.
But I would still read like the crucifixion as God using evil for good, not God using the evil of men for good. Like what he would say something like what Pontius Pilate and the Sadducees calculated as evil, God calculated for good. But I don't know. I mean, in the Gethsemane passage, it's like because it's interesting. He says, "With you, all things are possible." So he's insinuating that God might not even need to go through this crucifixion thing, because he says, "For you, all things are possible." So let this cup pass from me, because it's like you can do like we don't need to do this. But I mean, maybe he did have to do it, and he's like being, I don't know. What's funny is people say, "Oh, that's his human will," and his human will doesn't understand that it has to be done, and it's kind of a mess.
A parrot can talk.
Yeah. You saying I'm not being very informative?
No, I'm just saying when you're out there talking to Christians, a parrot can talk. But they don't necessarily know what they're saying.
I mean, well, I don't really talk to. I read stuff, and like the people I read are pretty strong. Like the big, heavy names.
Do you want to link to this little book?
I guess.
It changed me. There you go. In the private chat.
I got you. Yeah, it's hard. Like there's all those verses like God where he says like God does the good and the evil. God determines all things, or God, I don't know. But even if it's like he doesn't and he just permissively allows it, and by withdrawing grace he allows it, like you could still argue, okay, well, by withdrawing your grace you're allowing it, or you're causing it by withdrawing your grace. So even then he's like causally responsible for the evils.
Yeah, I think the thing that solves it for me is the moral component of it all. So when you wrap up evil with the same notion as moral, that doesn't work for me. Evil could be falling out of a tree. There's no moral component to falling out of a tree, but it's an evil experience. And we can generally say when man does evil, it's evil because they can't make it good. And then sometimes when man does evil, like with Joseph's brothers, they did mean it for evil. And they had no way to make it good, but God made it good.
It pulls me back to what he said. Well, if we remove all the context and say this one act, is it good or bad? Oh, it's bad. Well, then God is doing something bad. It's like, okay, if I'm making an omelet and I just crack eggs, if I crack eggs for no reason, that's evil. Like I'm not making anything out of it. But oh, suddenly if I'm cracking the eggs to make the omelet, now it makes sense. Or okay, slapping a child's hand is evil. Oh, but if I'm slapping a child's hand to prevent them from touching the stove, that's good. And you could say, well, in God's infinite, prescience and foreknowledge, He's allowed to make any drastic measures because He knows, like, ultimately, it's all
Right.
the
So
best thing.
if you're a gang member and you cut off someone's finger,
Mm.
that's one thing. But if you're a doctor and you cut off someone's finger to save them from gangrene, then that's another thing.
Or
Either way,
what's
you're
yeah.
cutting off someone's finger. So what's the motive? What's the circumstance? What are the relationships going on there?
Well, even taking it further and like God's prescience, it would be saying something like, oh well, I could do something horrendous even if it causes if it prevents some greater tragedy. Like you could say, oh, this guy, I don't know. I don't want to get into, the dirt or bring up any specific examples, but it's hard not to. So let's say, I think it's been a long enough time. Let's say, I don't know, 9/11. What they did was wrong. But what if what they did caused, the country to do something that was ultimately greater good than that? Then you could say, oh, what they did was good, but
Mm-hmm.
that would be like,
But they had no control over the outcome.
yeah, and they didn't even know that that would be the outcome. So
Yeah.
it's the difference of like what they have access, because then anything could be good or evil. Like I could punch you and I could say, oh, by punching you I saved the world,
I
sort of
think
thing.
one of the scholars that I've read somewhere said that a real good word for evil is break or breakage.
Destruction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If we go back to the Garden of Eden, Adam had it pretty good there, right? But did he know it? He didn't know it was good. I lived in Santa Barbara, California for about 20 years. I don't know if you've ever been there, but the weather is always perfect. It's either long sleeve weather or short sleeve weather, but it's pretty much always perfect. And so after 20 years, I just got totally used to it, and I foolishly moved up to Sandpoint, Idaho, which is 90 miles from the Canadian border. And we had 6 feet of snow for 6 or 7 months a year. Do you see my point?
Mm-hmm.
I got so used to the beautiful weather, it was like, shock to the soul to be inundated with inclement weather all the time. So I had it good. I had Santa Barbara was my Garden of Eden, and I didn't know how good it was because I'd been there so long until I moved to Sandpoint. And then when on occasion I flew back to Santa Barbara, and just getting off the plane, the weather was so beautiful. The sun was shining, and right next to the Santa Barbara airport, there's this little patch of asphalt, and there was a couple of trailers there on the asphalt, and some Mexicans were living in those trailers. And I thought, cool, I could live in that trailer with no grass, just to step outside to this wonderful sunshine. Adam did not know how good was until he ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because you can't know good without the other. You can't know good without evil. You can't know evil without good.
Yeah, I agree. Like, okay, it makes sense. This is what I had thought like originally. Okay, so why go through like the whole light and darkness as sort of like to reveal Himself? Whereas if there was no distinction, we wouldn't know that about Him. And I mean, that's an awfully lot of eggs. That's a lot of eggs to make that omelet, but at least there's like a purpose to it. Hey, I actually have a question. Do you think God is responsible for His creation? Like, does He have a duty to save it?
Yes, of course.
Okay, that I think I figured out, because that's the distinction I think between you and the other guys is they're thinking like, oh, God has no obligation to save anyone.
It's his.
Yeah.
It's his. Of course, it's his creation. He has an obligation to perfect it and complete it. And then obviously, we're not complete yet. And if God is not responsible for his creation, then God is irresponsible. There's no doubt about it. And the Christian message is constantly teaching that God is irresponsible.
Yeah, they have to.
He can't be bothered. There's not much difference between regular Christianity and the so called deism, which is, as I understand deism, God created it and then took a break. He's on vacation or something. He can't be bothered. Work it out for yourself with your own free will. You're responsible for your salvation.
Yeah. They wouldn't say like he's indifferent. They wouldn't say that. They just said that they would say like, oh, he doesn't have like a duty or a burden or an obligation, really.
Well, that requires indifference. If he were not indifferent, he'd be stressed out over the outcome of his creation.
Yeah, I mean, you have to say that. That's what they all say. He's trying so hard to save us. He wants to so desperately save all of us, but he just can't. Because the value of creating another being with free will is worth not being able to save them.
What? Oh, read the ticker tape below.
The
This
rest
is the
is up to you. God has done all he can do. Yeah.
God has done all he can do. The rest is up to you. That's a piss poor understanding of the operations of God and his love.
But here's the thing, like ultimately if because I still come away with ultimately the Bible is to reveal God and to establish a relationship with creation. And so the question is if he could he could just causally make everyone believe like he did with Saul, like he did with anyone he spoke to in the like obviously he just said, "Hey, what's up?" And a glorified Christ, walked into my room and was like, "Hey," like I would obviously believe. So why is it that he's like so hidden? Like what is it so important that he has to hide? If the most important thing is revealing himself, like the most important thing is revealing himself.
No. At this moment, during God's Aeonian purpose, it's pretty important that he hide himself and then reveal himself later.
No, it's fine for you because he reveals himself later, and then you can. So for you, it's fine. But I'm saying, like, if I'm going to be damned in this life for it, then
Okay, I see.
yeah,
Yeah, so why would he hide himself and then
and
damn
then
you to
never,
hell?
and then, yeah,
And then damn you to hell. Okay.
like if he's trying so hard, like I mean, and I know it comes up in the thing where they said even if he rose from the dead, they wouldn't believe. I mean, it's hard not to disagree with him there. Like I would like to think I would obviously believe at that point, or like if anything, like even if like this empty bottle, if it would literally just rise an inch off the bed, I would believe like immediately, like without any doubts. But
Somehow, howdy, somehow, some way, God gave me the faith to believe. I don't know how I got it. I didn't gen it up on my own. It was,
you were outchosen. That's what the Calvinists say too. You were just nothing you could do about it.
And yet, I've met and talked to quite a few Calvinists who doubt their own salvation.
Yeah, it's strange.
Because they don't have a proper understanding of Paul's message. If they doubt their own salvation, then Christ saved no one at the cross. He either saves everyone at the cross or no one at the cross. Christ is so intimately connected to humanity that we are in him. His experience is our experience, or will be. there's going to be such a oneness at the reconciliation. We will all breathe a sigh of relief, if we could say that. We go, wow,
What are we gonna say? Like, oh, that was a good story.
it was. Did you ever see the the Civil War documentary on PBS? Who did put it out? Ken Roberts or something? I can't remember who put it out.
I remember it was funny. Was it the one where like most of them were like there was like they were mostly pro North, and there was like that one pro Southern guy who would always say, "Well, them good old boys."
Oh, it's Shelby Foote when the
Yeah,
Shelby
yeah.
Foote.
Oh, yeah, Shelby Foot. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, but at one time, I was really into studying the Civil War history, right? And so I watched with great enthusiasm the whole PBS documentary. It was like 12 or 20 episodes or something. And at the very end of it, as he's closing up the last episode, you get this southern music. Maybe it's on a violin or a fiddle, and or maybe you hear the what are they called, the casadas that you hear down south.
yeah. Oh,
Those
cicadas. Those.
cicadas, yeah. Anyway, so he ends it by reading this poem, and it's a lovely poem. And I don't remember how it went, but I do remember one line from the poem, that all these soldiers in that great day will rise from the dead and say, "My, didn't it seem real?" I thought that was amazing. I just love that line. My, didn't it seem real?
Yeah. I don't know. It takes a lot of wind out of my sails because I like to think that I'm actually doing things, and these things actually
So you want to
aren't
boast
like
in
a.
your, you want to
Yeah.
boast in yourself, huh?
Yeah. I don't know. I have that
I'll
feeling that
boast in
I'm
you. You're great. Let me do your boasting for you.
not even that I'm great or bad, but just that I'm actually like doing things. Like I'm doing my will, I guess. I'm not like an actor in a book. How am I different from Darth Vader or Luke Skywalker? Because this is all what it comes down to. It's like if it's a story, it's a story, it's a story. I'm on the level of Homer Simpson. I'd like to think I'm more than Homer Simpson, though.
Uh-huh.
Why did you make me this?
Can you imagine getting to the place where you're happy with how he made you?
If I don't think I could be satisfied if I was, just like a fictional character.
I have a hard time imagining that I'm a fictional character, although, I can hear people talk about, this is like divine theatrics. And I don't mind that metaphor, but I'm pretty happy with how God has made me and all the experiences I've had in my 70 some years of life. It's been pretty cool. There were plenty of times as a young man that I had hot tears, as many hot tears as anybody else. It was awful. But I look back now and go, that was cool. It seemed real at the time.
Yeah, I don't know. It makes me feel really bad for the people who have like really bad lives and don't, have that looking back on it sort of thing. Like, I mean, obviously, like in terms of like humanity, like we've been pretty lucky and prosperous and fortunate compared with most of humanity.
But there's so much ignorance, right? and and from my own personal experience, ignorance is pretty cool. Like when I grew up on a farm, a 700-acre farm in Virginia, and we were poor, but I didn't know it. I didn't know we were poor. We were having a blast.
Yeah.
I didn't know we were poor until I got out in the world and started hanging out with upper middle class and rich people that lived in a $7 million mansion. I didn't know we were poor. I just was having a blast with tree forts and chasing the pigs on the farm, and we never starved. We had plenty of cookies.
Yeah, maybe it is. Maybe like good, like if you're saying like experiences, satisfaction, pleasure, pain, negativity, it's all like just like a matter of perspective.
And time.
Mm.
Time plus evil, or shall we say evil plus time equals good.
But
So time.
I think it has to have a purpose though, because what if like you would agree that if like he's gonna just torture us for eternity, that's not good. So
That's pretty dang evil, yeah.
so I think that there has to be like some ultimate good purpose to shoot for, right?
And God is shooting for it. He will be
Hopefully.
all in Howdy and all in Ace. And boy, won't we look back, you and I, and say, wow, didn't it seem real?
So
Remember
I
when I
mean,
was complaining? God, why did you make me this?
yeah, I mean, if you're right, I mean, I would probably feel that way. Although I'm hopefully we're doing more than just reminiscing about the 70, 80 years of life we have for eternity. It's like, remember when I was like just replaying my life over and
Uh huh.
over? I wonder what it's going to be like.
It'll be something to not be fickled with death and dying. That'll be cool.
Yeah.
And I mean, when this mortal puts on immortality, not only can we not die, but all of our emotions will have to change as well. Because when we're immortal and someone pushes us off a cliff, you can't die. You can't starve. And if someone gossiped about you who wasn't immortal, they were still mortal, and they gossiped about you, you'd laugh. You go, "What? So?" And you wouldn't even be tempted to gossip because you're not, because mortality is the process of dying. And so with that comes what? Insecurities, low self esteem. And so you'll gossip about others just to make yourself feel better because you're mortal.
Maybe I'm thinking in my head, how would I act if I was let's say a genie granted my wish and I became immortal? Would I change my behaviors?
Of course you would. If you were truly immortal, you couldn't have a bad attitude. You couldn't even sin because sin is a mistake. So you couldn't make mistakes. If you fell off a cliff, it wouldn't be a mistake because you can't die. The dying process fucks us all up.
I, I feel like I would be very what's the word where you're like, I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow. I'll just keep putting things off because I could always keep putting things off. You know,
Well, that's
when I,
because you have the liberty to put things off. But when there's, the circumstances change and you're pressed, stressed, all the mortality's catching up to you. You've got to pay the rent and you don't have the money. You got to do something. So you will lose that procrastination at that time. So what are you talking about? You're mixing realities. What
mm,
we deal with in the mortal is a pain in the ass. But when God makes all alive in Christ, there will be no pain in the ass.
yeah. I mean, I guess I could accept. I don't know exactly what it'll be. It'll just be like definitionally good. Well, according to this paper, God used evil to fix evil.
No, he used sin to fix sin.
Uh,
I suppose you
wait,
could say that God sending Christ to the cross was evil. But on the cross, we have the greatest demonstration of evil and good because he came out of the grave 3 days later, unable to die again.
what's interesting is you earlier said that God is aiming for something, and also that God has a duty and a responsibility. So does God? Is there a law for God? Like he has a mark, like a Torah.
He has a mark. I would maybe, if I understand the question, I might say that Christ is the mark. He has a duty to make us all like Christ. We will be made alive in him. And even now, Colossians 3:3 says, your life is actually hid together with Christ in God. That's how sure the outcome is.
Okay, so but when he, you know, Isaac his only begotten son, wouldn't that be hitting the mark?
When he did what to his only begotten son?
I said Isaac, but
Oh,
because I was just reading it because he was talking about plunging the dagger, alluding to.
yeah, I suppose you could say that.
Well, then if like that's what he's supposed to do, and he hit the mark, and he didn't miss the mark, then how would that be sin?
It's just a figure of speech.
Okay.
All of our metaphors fall apart at the edges, especially with you guys with big brains and lots of questions.
Yeah. It all comes down to perspective a lot of the times, I think. So what do you think? I've been yapping. What did you think about this guy and him and his preface and his conclusion?
Um, it was encouraging and encouraged us to have faith in the operations of God. God made Christ to be sin for us. It doesn't make any sense in the human brain because naturally human says two wrongs don't make a right. But in the grand operation of God, he's doing a lot of things all at once. He's juggling a lot of balls. Every speck of stardust he is in absolute control of. Every hair on our head, he's got them counted. And he's in the middle of creation. He hasn't, creation has begun, but it's not finished yet. He won't be finished with creation until the close of the eon of the eons. Then death will be abolished, all will be made alive in Christ, and that's when the party really begins.
Hmm. I was actually looking at Revelations, and was it Colossians or the one where he talks about the final enemy to be defeated is death?
1 Corinthians 15:26.
Corinthians. I was looking at Revelations where it says like when the new Jerusalem comes down, the proto heaven and proto earth are will be no more, and then they get the new heaven and the new earth,
Mm-hmm.
and then we get the new holy Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says but then he says, and death will be no more, or
Mm-hmm.
something along those lines. But I understand you take it that death isn't truly defeated.
Not at that moment in time, but death will not progress anymore. But
Right.
at that moment in time, not all of the dead are made alive in Christ, but it won't go any further. So in the final eon of time, people will live for many generations. Death will not be a big issue in the final eon, but it won't be abolished altogether until the final eon is done.
Okay, so death gets cast into the lake of fire. Then the new heaven comes down. And we finish up with Revelations, the people in the nations and out of the nations, and then that's like still the 1,000-year reign, maybe. No,
The
well,
1,000 year
well,
reign has passed, right?
yeah.
And so the book of Revelation closes up with the introduction of the new heavens and the new earth, which would be the final eon. But it doesn't go very far into the final eon to talk about it.
Hmm.
We don't get that information until 1 Corinthians 15:20 to 28. At the at the conclusion of that final eon, Christ will give up his reign. He must reign until he does four things. He must abolish rulership, authority, power, and death. Those are the final four enemies of God to be abolished. Humans are not even listed in there. Humans are not the enemy of God in 1 Corinthians 15:20 to 28. It's the enemies, the real enemies of God are rulership, authority, and power and death. Why? Because as long as God needs to rule and have authority and power and, with the threat of death, well, then creation's not been perfected yet. There's still some animosity and angst out there among the universe that has to have a chokehold on them. Got to rule over them. Got to threaten them with death. But when
Yeah.
God can bring creation into perfection, rulership, authority, and power become irrelevant, including Christ's rulership, authority, and power. That's why he can give up the kingdom to his God and Father. He won't even exercise the threat of death. He's going to abolish death. And when you get rid of death, that's the power of rule and authority and power. You can't have rule, authority, and power without the threat of death. So when he gets rid of death, there goes rulership, authority, and power. He can't have, they're gone too. And God then will be all in all.
I have a question. Like at the end of Revelation, where it says, like, okay, we get the lake of fire, then we get the new heavens, new earth, and the new Jerusalem. But then it says that there's the city of Jerusalem, but it seems like there's other things outside of Jerusalem. It says
Yeah.
like the nations, the
Mm-hmm.
regents of the earth land bring their glory into her.
Right.
Is it saying that everyone's going to go into the New Jerusalem, or is there going to be a New Jerusalem and then nations outside of it?
I believe there'll be nations outside of it.
Okay.
But that's still short sighted of John.
Hmm.
He doesn't see as far into the future as Paul does.
Yeah, like it doesn't have Jesus handing it, like he's still on the throne
Right.
at the end of Revelation.
Not only is he on the throne, but the 12 are on the throne with him. Israel's ruling the nations. And as long as Israel is ruling the nations, we still have a bit of a problem.
Oh, yeah. The regents of the earthland, they're still ruling their
Yeah.
kingdoms.
So if they have to rule, there's still a bit of a problem out there somehow, or else you wouldn't need to rule. And that's why Paul's revelation goes further and deeper and more beautiful than John's revelation. When John closes up his book in chapter 22, you still have the nations have to eat of the leaves of the tree of life every
Hmm.
month.
For
If
their
they had
cure.
no death in them, why do they have to eat of the tree of life every month? Because there's still mortality present when John closes up his book. Mortality needs rulership over them. He doesn't see that far into the future where death itself is absolutely abolished.
What about the old stuff? Because this is something that I've been struggling to reconcile, like the New Testament eschatological prophecies and the Old Testament eschatological prophecies. Like they're similar, but they're
Mm-hmm.
kind of different. Like when does Daniel happen? When does uh, the day of the Lord? Like I guess the day of the Lord is like the first resurrection, right?
It would, yeah, we could say that. As far as how I concluded the matter, the day of the Lord is the 1,000-year reign of Christ.
Oh,
And
because a
after,
1,000 years are like a day.
yeah, that would be the day of the Lord. And then we have this unusual phrase called the day of God. And that would be after the day of the Lord, after the great white throne and the New Jerusalem comes down. Then we begin the day of God. That would be the eon of the eons.
Mm.
And it's more beautiful in its accomplishment. The day of God is more beautiful than the day of the Lord. Because during the day of God, at the conclusion of the day of God, or the eon of the eons, that's when Christ gives up his kingdom and abolishes rulership, authority, and power, and death. And then God can be all in all.
Yeah, makes sense. I'm running out of questions.
Oh, darn, we'll have to close up the show. And all the side chatters will have to go over to JG's channel.
Mm.
I pity you, side chatters. Because they will get snarky with you if you have too much good news to say. But Tim Smith, you'll be quite comfortable over there.
Who's Tim Smith?
He's our resident free will lover.
Uh,
See?
he is inside of you. I can't see him.
He likes to argue.
He didn't die. Jesus returned after death and ascended. Some call heaven. Is he in heaven or in me? Are you in heaven? I thought you were here. What are they yapping about?
I'm so glad you stopped by. You delight me.
Well, definitely a lot to chew on. More of stuff to ponder.
Yeah, if you read this book from the PDF, let me know. Give me your feedback on the matter. In fact, come back and give us a book report or a chapter report or whatever you do with it.
Yeah, if I get around to it, I'll definitely relay my musings.
Okay, good. That's it, boys and girls. Thanks for stopping by. Give me a thumbs up. Leave comments and share this episode with somebody because it ain't very long. You know what I mean? Grace to you. Bye for now.